The auction block stood stark against the blazing Arizona sunset, casting long shadows across the dusty main street of Ventura. Georgina Clarke clutched her threadbare shawl tightly around her shoulders, her emerald eyes vacant as the auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowd of weathered faces and expensive hats. It wasn't legal to sell a person, not in 1875, but everyone present knew what this indentured servant auction really meant. Next up, a 20-year-old woman. Good for housework, cooking, and other domestic duties, the auctioneer announced, his voice emotionless as he gestured toward Georgina. 5 years of service to pay off her father's debts. Bidding starts at $50. The summer heat pressed down like a physical weight, but Georgina felt nothing but cold inside. 3 weeks ago, her father had gambled away their ranch, their savings, and finally, in a desperate bid to win it all back, her future. Then he'd promptly drunk himself to death, leaving her to face the consequences. At the back of the crowd, Quincy Alexander shifted uncomfortably atop his dappled gray stallion. The tall, broad-shouldered cowboy had only stopped in Ventura to resupply, before heading back to his ranch, 15 miles outside of town. He hadn't expected to witness a woman being sold to cover a dead man's debts. His weathered fingers tightened around his reins as the bidding began. $50, called a voice from the crowd. 60, countered another. Quincy studied the woman on the platform. Even with her head bowed, her auburn hair falling in tangled waves around her face, he could see the proud set of her shoulders. This wasn't a woman born to servitude. This was a free spirit being broken before his eyes. $100, came a slurred voice that made Georgina's head snap up in alarm. Hank Wilcox, the owner of Ventura's largest saloon and a man with a reputation that made decent women cross the street when they saw him coming. 120, called another voice. 200, Wilcox countered, a predatory smile spreading across his face as he stared openly at Georgina. The crowd fell silent. $200 was more than most men made in months. 200 going once. The auctioneer called, scanning the crowd. Georgina's eyes darted desperately across the sea of faces. No one would meet her gaze. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. She'd heard stories about girls who'd been employed at Wilcox's establishment. None of them ended well. 200 going twice. $300, a deep voice called from the back of the crowd. Heads turned to see Quincy Alexander raising his hand, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Wilcox's face darkened. $350, he spat. Quincy didn't hesitate. $400. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew Quincy Alexander ran one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory, but this was an extraordinary sum for a servant. 500, Wilcox growled, his knuckles white around his whiskey glass. Quincy straightened in his saddle. $1,000, he stated, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. Wilcox's face contorted with rage, but even in his drunken state, he knew he couldn't match the bid. He turned and stormed back into his saloon, slamming the batwing doors behind him. Sold, the auctioneer declared, barely concealing his surprise. To Mr. Alexander for $1,000. Georgina stood frozen as Quincy dismounted and approached the platform. The sheriff, who had been overseeing the proceedings, handed him a document to sign. Georgina stared at the paper that would legally bind her to this stranger for 5 years. $1,000. What kind of man spent that much on a servant? What would he expect in return? Quincy signed the paper with a quick scrawl, paid the sheriff, and finally turned to face Georgina. His eyes, a clear blue that reminded her of summer skies, met hers directly. "Miss Clarke," he said, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. I'm Quincy Alexander. My ranch is a half-day's ride from here. I could use someone to help with the cooking and keeping house, but you'll have your own cabin and the right to refuse any task you find. Objectionable. Georgina studied him suspiciously. Men didn't spend $1,000 out of kindness. Why? She asked, her voice hoarse from hours of silence. Quincy glanced toward the saloon where Wilcox had disappeared. No one deserves to be owned, he said simply, least of all by a man like that. He offered her his hand to help her down from the platform. Georgina hesitated, then placed her trembling fingers in his calloused palm. His grip was firm but gentle as he guided her down. I have a horse for you, he said, nodding toward a chestnut mare tethered nearby. Can you ride? I grew up on a ranch, she replied stiffly. I can ride. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Good. We should leave town before Wilcox sobers up enough to cause trouble. Georgina looked around the town that had been her home her entire life. There was nothing left for her here, no family, no friends brave enough to speak against the auction, no possessions save the clothes on her back, and a small bundle containing a change of clothes and her mother's locket. I'm ready, she said, squaring her shoulders. As they rode out of Ventura, Georgina could feel the weight of curious stares following them. She kept her back straight, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She had no illusions about what her life would be now. She would work off her father's debt, one day at a time, and then. She didn't know. She couldn't see that far ahead anymore. They rode in silence until the town disappeared behind them. The vast landscape of the Arizona Territory stretched before them, red rock formations, sparse vegetation, and endless sky. In another time, Georgina might have found it beautiful. Are you hungry? Quincy asked, breaking the silence. We can stop and eat something before continuing. Georgina hadn't eaten since the previous day, but pride made her shake her head. I'm fine. Quincy regarded her for a long moment, then nodded toward a cluster of trees beside a small creek. We'll rest the horses anyway. It's a hot day. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle and helped Georgina down, though she hardly needed assistance. From his saddlebag, he produced bread, dried beef, and a canteen of water. It's not much, he said, offering her food first, but we'll have a proper meal when we reach the ranch. Georgina accepted the food warily. Thank you, she said stiffly. They ate in silence, the only sounds the soft nickering of the horses and the gentle burbling of the creek. Quincy didn't press her to talk, and Georgina was grateful. She needed time to process everything that had happened. Mr. Alexander, she finally said, setting aside her barely touched food. I want to understand what you expect of me. Quincy looked up from where he'd been absently twirling a blade of grass between his fingers. I expect you to cook, clean, and help maintain the household. In return, you'll have food, shelter, and safety. He paused. And when your 5 years are up, you'll have your freedom and enough money saved to start over wherever you choose. Georgina's eyes narrowed. And that's all. Understanding dawned in his eyes, and a faint blush colored his tanned cheeks. That's all, Miss Clarke. I'm not in the habit of. I wouldn't. He cleared his throat. You have my word. Something in his straightforward manner made Georgina want to believe him, but experience had taught her to be cautious. Her father had made promises too, until whiskey and cards became more important than keeping his word. I appreciate the clarification, she said formally, standing and brushing crumbs from her skirt. We should continue if we want to reach your ranch before dark. Quincy nodded, gathering their things and helping her back onto her horse. As they resumed their journey, Georgina studied him surreptitiously. He was younger than she'd initially thought, probably in his late 20s. His features were strong, a straight nose, defined jawline, and those startling blue eyes. His dark hair curled slightly where it fell past the collar of his shirt, and his hands, though weathered by work, handled the reins with surprising gentleness. He didn't look like the sort of man who would spend $1,000 on impulse, yet he had. Georgina couldn't decide if that made him a fool or something else entirely. The Alexander ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent. Georgina had expected something modest, but what she saw took her breath away. A large, two-story house stood proudly amid several outbuildings, all well-maintained. Vast pastures stretched in every direction, dotted with cattle. This wasn't just a successful operation. It was one of the largest spreads she'd ever seen. "Welcome to Rocking A," Quincy said quietly, noting her surprise. As they approached, a weathered man with silver-streaked hair emerged from one of the barns. He raised a hand in greeting. "That's Samuel Jenkins," Quincy explained. "Foreman. Been with us since my father started this place." "Us?" Georgina asked. "My younger brother, Gabriel, lives here too. He handles the business side of things, contracts, sales, that sort of work." They dismounted in front of the main house, and Samuel approached to take the horses. His eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of Georgina, but he merely nodded respectfully. "Evening, miss," he said, tipping his hat. "Boss," he added to Quincy, "didn't expect you back with company." "Miss Clarke will be staying with us," Quincy explained simply. "She'll be helping with the household." Samuel's eyes showed a flicker of understanding, but he just nodded again. "I'll see to the horses. Supper's almost ready. Martha's made stew." "Martha Jenkins is Samuel's wife," Quincy told Georgina as they climbed the porch steps. "She's been cooking and keeping house since my mother passed. She'll show you the ropes." The interior of the house was surprisingly elegant, with polished wooden floors, comfortable furniture, and shelves lined with books. It spoke of wealth, but not ostentation, a home rather than a showpiece. "Your cabin is out back," Quincy said, leading her through the house and out a rear door. "It's small, but it should be comfortable." The cabin was indeed small, but it was clean and well built, with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and a small stove for heat. A washstand stood in one corner with a pitcher and basin. It was simple but far better than what Georgina had feared. "There's a pump just outside for water," Quincy explained, "and an outhouse behind those trees. I'll give you some time to settle in. Supper's in the main house in about half an hour if you'd like to join us." Georgina nodded, unable to find words. When she was alone, she sank onto the bed and finally allowed herself to cry, not loud, racking sobs, but silent tears of relief, grief, and uncertainty. She had been sold to pay a debt, torn from everything familiar, and yet somehow landed in a place that seemed, at least for the moment, safe. After washing her face and changing into her one clean dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better days, but was at least free of the dust of the auction block, Georgina made her way to the main house. She found Quincy in conversation with a slender young man who shared his dark hair and strong features but lacked his weathered appearance. "Ah, Miss Clarke," Quincy said, turning at her entrance. "This is my brother Gabriel. Gabe, this is Miss Georgina Clarke. She'll be helping Martha with the house." Gabriel Alexander regarded her with curious eyes. "Welcome to Rocking A, Miss Clarke," he said, his manner polite but reserved. A stout, kindly-faced woman emerged from what Georgina assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. "So this is the girl," she said, her voice warm with a slight southern accent. "I'm Martha Jenkins, dear. Come help me bring out the food and we can get acquainted." In the kitchen, Martha worked efficiently, ladling stew into a large tureen while Georgina arranged biscuits in a basket. "So," Martha said quietly, Quincy told me a little about how you came to be here. I want you to know you're safe at Rocking A. The Alexanders are good men, cut from better cloth than most." Georgina's hand stilled. "Did he tell you everything, that he purchased me?" Martha's kind eyes met hers. "He told me enough, and I know Quincy Alexander wouldn't have left a young woman to the likes of Hank Wilcox, no matter the cost." She patted Georgina's hand. "Give it time, dear. Things have a way of working out." Supper was a quiet affair. Gabriel asked about Quincy's trip to town, and they discussed ranch business, cattle prices, a pending contract with the Army, repairs needed for the north fence line. Georgina ate silently, aware of occasional glances from both brothers but grateful they didn't press her to join the conversation. After the meal, Martha showed Georgina what would be expected of her, helping with cooking, cleaning, laundry, and other household tasks. The work would be substantial but not overwhelming, especially with Martha to share the load. The boy's mother passed when Gabriel was just 12, Martha explained as they washed dishes. Their father followed 5 years later. Quincy was barely 20 when he took over running this place. He's built it into something special. "And no wife?" Georgina asked before she could stop herself. Martha smiled knowingly. "No. There was a girl once, but she couldn't stand ranch life, too isolated, too much work. She left for San Francisco. That was 3 years ago." When Georgina returned to her cabin that night, exhaustion finally overtook her. She fell into a dreamless sleep, the first peaceful rest she'd had since her father's final, fatal wager. The following weeks established a routine. Georgina rose at dawn to help Martha prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. Mornings were spent cleaning, afternoons devoted to laundry or baking or preserving, depending on the day. She rarely saw Quincy, who spent most daylight hours out on the range with the cattle or overseeing other ranch operations. Gabriel was a more frequent presence in the house, often working at the large desk in what had been his father's study. Despite her initial wariness, Georgina found herself gradually relaxing. No one at the Rocking A treated her like property. Martha was kind, Samuel respectful, and Gabriel politely distant. The ranch hands tipped their hats when they saw her but maintained a proper distance. And Quincy barely spoke to her at all, though she sometimes caught him watching her with an unreadable expression when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening in late August, about a month after her arrival, Georgina was hanging laundry behind her cabin when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Quincy riding toward her, leading a second horse, a beautiful Palomino mare. He dismounted and approached, hat in hand. "Evening, Miss Clarke," he said, his voice as gentle as always. "I was wondering if you might join me for a ride. There's something I'd like to show you." Georgina glanced at the half-hung laundry. "I should finish my work." "It'll keep," he said with a small smile, "and the view is best at sunset." Curiosity overcame her reservations. "Let me change my shoes," she agreed. Minutes later, they were riding across the vast expanse of the Rocking A, Quincy leading the way toward a ridge to the west of the main house. They rode in companionable silence, something that had become strangely comfortable between them, despite their limited interactions. The ridge overlooked a lush valley, hidden from view of the main house by the surrounding hills. A small stream wound through stands of cottonwoods, and wildflowers dotted the grass. As the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant orange and pink, the scene took on an almost magical quality. "It's beautiful," Georgina breathed, forgetting for a moment the circumstances that had brought her to this place. "My mother used to bring us here," Quincy said, his voice soft with memory. "She called it her secret garden, though it's hardly a garden. Just a pretty piece of land that caught her fancy." He glanced at Georgina. "I thought you might like it. You seemed in need of something beautiful." Georgina looked at him in surprise, touched that he had noticed and more touched that he had cared. "Thank you," she said simply. They sat in silence for a time, watching the sunset transform the landscape. Finally, Quincy spoke again. "You've been here a month, Miss Clarke, and I've barely spoken to you. That's not very hospitable of me." "You've been more than hospitable," Georgina replied. "You've been kind when you had no reason to be." Quincy's eyes, reflecting the golden light of sunset, met hers. "I had every reason to be. No one should own another person's future." "Yet legally, you do own mine," she pointed out. "For 5 years at least." He shook his head firmly. "That paper the sheriff made me sign. I tore it up the moment we left town. As far as I'm concerned, you're free to leave whenever you choose." Georgina stared at him, stunned. "But the money was worth every penny to keep you from Wilcox," he said flatly. "I don't expect repayment, though you're welcome to stay and work if that's what you want." Georgina felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Free. She was free. The knowledge should have been exhilarating, but instead it left her feeling strangely hollow. Where would she go? What would she do? She had no family, no resources, no prospects. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. Quincy shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You don't have to say anything, just thought you should know." As they rode back to the ranch in the gathering dusk, Georgina found herself studying Quincy with new eyes. He was not at all what she had expected. In a world where men like her father gambled away everything that mattered and men like Hank Wilcox viewed women as commodities, Quincy Alexander was something rare, indeed a man of principle. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake, turning over her options in her mind. She could head to Tucson or Phoenix or even California, try to find work as a seamstress or shopgirl. But the thought held little appeal. The truth was, despite everything, she had begun to feel at home at the Rocking A. Martha had become almost a mother figure, Samuel a kindly uncle. Even Gabriel, reserved as he was, had begun to thaw, sometimes joining her and Martha for tea in the afternoons. And then there was Quincy. Quincy, who had spent a fortune to save her from a fate worse than death. Quincy, who had torn up her indenture papers without telling her. Quincy, who looked at her sometimes with something in his eyes that made her heart beat a little faster. Morning found her resolute. After breakfast, she sought out Quincy in the stables, where he was checking a horse's hoof. "I'd like to stay," she said without preamble. "Not as whatever I was before, but as an employee with wages." Quincy straightened, his expression carefully neutral. "You're sure you could go anywhere, start fresh?" "I'm sure," she said firmly. "I have nowhere else to go and—" She hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I feel safe here." Something softened in his eyes. "Then you're welcome to stay, Miss Clarke, and of course you'll have wages." He named a sum that was more than fair, generous even. "Thank you, Mr. Alexander," she said formally, extending her hand. He took it, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "Quincy," he corrected gently. "If you're staying, you might as well use my name." A smile tugged at her lips. "Georgina, then." His answering smile transformed his face, lighting his eyes and revealing a dimple in his right cheek that she'd never noticed before. "Georgina," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. In the months that followed, Georgina found herself settling into life at the Rocking with surprising ease. Her relationship with Martha deepened into true friendship, and the older woman began teaching her not just household tasks, but the herbal remedies and healing practices she'd learned from her own mother. "Never know when such knowledge might come in handy," Martha said as she showed Georgina how to make a poultice for burns. "Especially out here, where doctors are few and far between." Georgina also discovered a talent for bookkeeping, much to Gabriel's delight. He gladly handed over some of the ledgers, which gave her a better understanding of the ranch's operations and freed him to spend more time helping Quincy with the cattle. And then there was Quincy himself. Their relationship had shifted subtly since their sunset ride. He sought her company more frequently, inviting her to ride with him on his inspections of the property, asking her opinion on ranch matters, sometimes simply sitting with her on the porch after supper, watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. They talked easily about everything and nothing: books they had read, memories of childhood, hopes for the future. Georgina learned that he had a dry sense of humor, a passion for astronomy, and a deep love for the land that had been in his family for 2 generations. He, in turn, discovered her quick wit, her skill with numbers, and her surprising knowledge of cattle breeding gleaned from growing up on her father's much smaller ranch. What neither spoke of was the growing attraction between them. Georgina felt it in the way her pulse quickened when he smiled at her, in how she found herself watching for his return when he was away from the ranch. She saw it reflected in the way his gaze lingered on her, how he found excuses to be near her, the gentleness in his touch when their hands occasionally brushed. But always, there was the shadow of how they had met: the auction block, the $1,000, the debt that, paid or not, still existed between them. It was an invisible barrier neither seemed able to cross. Winter came to the Arizona territory, not with snow but with cooler temperatures and occasional rain. The pace of ranch work slowed somewhat, giving everyone more time for indoor pursuits. Martha organized a small Christmas celebration, and Georgina found herself swept up in the preparations: baking cookies, making simple gifts, decorating the main house with pine boughs and red ribbons. On Christmas Eve, after a festive dinner with the entire ranch staff, Quincy asked Georgina to walk with him. The night was clear and crisp, stars blazing overhead in a way that still took her breath away after months in this open country. "I have something for you," he said as they reached the garden behind the main house. He pulled a small package from his pocket, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Quincy, you shouldn't have," she protested, though her fingers itched to open it. "I wanted to," he said simply. "Go on." Inside was a small leather-bound book, a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson. Georgina ran her fingers over the embossed cover, touched beyond words. She had mentioned once, months ago, how much she loved Dickinson's work. "How did you remember?" she asked softly. "I remember everything you tell me," he admitted, his voice low. Georgina looked up to find him watching her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. Something in his gaze made her heart stutter. "I have something for you too," she said, reaching into her pocket. Her gift seemed inadequate now: a handkerchief she had embroidered with his initials, QA, surrounded by a simple design of stars. "It's not much." "It's perfect," he said, running his thumb over the stitching. "You made this yourself." She nodded, embarrassed by the rough quality of her needlework compared to the fine book he had given her. "Then it's the most valuable gift I've received," he said with such sincerity that she had to believe him. They stood close in the cold night air, the space between them charged with unspoken words. Quincy took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Georgina," he began, then hesitated. "I find myself thinking about you more than is probably proper for an employer." Her heart leapt, but caution made her step back slightly. "Quincy, she faltered. "I can't forget how we met, what you paid." Pain flashed across his face. "Is that what you think, that I feel entitled to your affection because of that money?" "No," she said quickly. "Not entitled. But I wonder sometimes if I feel what I feel because you saved me, because I'm grateful." "And what do you feel?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Georgina took a deep breath. "I feel," Drawn to you, I think about you when you're not there. I look forward to seeing you each day." She looked down at the book in her hands. "But I'm afraid to trust those feelings when they're tangled up with everything else." Quincy nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, though the disappointment in his eyes belied his calm tone. "Perhaps with time." "Perhaps," she agreed softly. They walked back to the house in silence, the moment of connection both strengthened and complicated by their honesty. January brought unusually heavy rains, turning the normally dry creek beds into rushing torrents and making ranch work difficult and dangerous. Quincy and the hands were constantly out checking the cattle, moving herds to higher ground, reinforcing fences washed away by sudden floods. Georgina found herself watching anxiously each time Quincy rode out, relief washing over her when he returned safely. She couldn't deny the truth. Any longer her feelings for him had grown far beyond gratitude or friendship. But still, she hesitated to act on them, unsure if she could ever truly separate her emotions from the circumstances that had brought them together. One particularly stormy night, Quincy and several hands had been out since dawn checking on a herd in the north pasture. Dinner had come and gone with no sign of them. Georgina paced the floor of the main house, peering out windows into the driving rain, while Martha tried to distract her with busy work. "They'll be fine," Martha assured her for the dozenth time. "Quincy knows this land better than anyone. He won't take unnecessary risks." "It's been hours," Georgina fretted, "and this rain." The door burst open and Samuel stumbled in, soaked to the skin. "Need help," he gasped. "Quincy's hurt. Creek bed collapsed. He's pinned under his horse." Georgina's heart seemed to stop. Martha sprang into action, calling for Gabriel, gathering medical supplies. Before anyone could stop her, Georgina had grabbed her coat and rushed out into the storm, following Samuel to where several ranch hands were struggling to free Quincy from beneath his fallen horse. The scene was chaos, mud everywhere, men shouting over the roar of the rain, the horse thrashing weakly in panic. Quincy lay half submerged in muddy water, his face ghostly pale in the lantern light. Georgina pushed through the men, dropping to her knees beside him. His eyes were closed, blood mingling with rain on his forehead. "Quincy," she called, taking his face in her hands. "Quincy, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on her face. "Georgina," he murmured, "you shouldn't be out in this." "Be quiet," she ordered, relief making her voice sharper than intended. "We're going to get you out of here." The men had managed to calm the horse and were working to lift it enough to pull Quincy free. With a tremendous heave, they raised the animal just enough, and two hands quickly dragged Quincy clear. He cried out in pain as they moved him, his face contorting. "My leg," he gasped. "Broken, most likely," Samuel said grimly. "We need to get him back to the house." They fashioned a makeshift stretcher and carried Quincy through the driving rain back to the ranch house. By the time they arrived, he had lost consciousness again. The next hours were a blur of activity. Martha, drawing on years of practical medical knowledge, determined that Quincy's left leg was indeed broken, along with several ribs. He also had a nasty gash on his head and was burning with fever. "The doctor won't be able to get here in this weather," Martha said grimly. "We'll have to do what we can ourselves." Georgina refused to leave Quincy's side as Martha set his leg as best she could, cleaned and stitched his head wound, and wrapped his ribs tightly. Through it all, he remained unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored, his skin hot to the touch. "Now we wait," Martha said when they had done all they could, "and pray." Gabriel brought a chair for Georgina and placed it beside Quincy's bed. "You should rest," he told her gently. She shook her head. "I'm staying with him." Gabriel studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "He cares for you very much, you know." Georgina's eyes filled with tears. "I know," she whispered. "I care for him too." "Then tell him," Gabriel advised. "When he wakes up." He squeezed her shoulder and left her alone with Quincy. Through that long night, Georgina bathed Quincy's fevered brow, changed his bandages, and spoke to him softly, hoping he could hear her somehow. She told him stories of her childhood, recited poems from the book he had given her, and finally, in the darkest hour before dawn, confessed what she had been too afraid to say before. "I love you," she whispered, holding his hand between both of hers. "I love you, and it has nothing to do with gratitude or debt or anything else. I love your kindness, your strength, your quiet way of caring for everyone around you. I love how you look at the stars, how gentle you are with frightened horses, how you never raise your voice in anger." Tears slid down her cheeks. "Please don't leave me now that I've finally figured it out." As if in answer, Quincy's fingers tightened slightly around hers. His eyes opened, clearer than they had been since the accident. "Georgina," he murmured, his voice weak but steady. "Say it again." Her heart leapt. "I love you," she repeated, a watery smile breaking through her tears. "Good," he whispered, "because I've loved you since I saw you standing on that auction block, too proud to beg for mercy even when your world was falling apart." Quincy's recovery was slow and painful. The doctor, arriving 2 days later when the roads cleared, confirmed Martha's diagnosis: broken leg, cracked ribs, concussion, and praised her treatment. But he also warned that Quincy would need weeks of rest before he could return to his usual activities. For a man used to spending most of his waking hours in the saddle, the forced inactivity was torture. Quincy became restless and irritable, snapping at everyone except Georgina, who bore his frustration with patient understanding. "I feel useless," he confessed to her one afternoon as she helped him move from his bed to a chair by the window. "Gabriel and the men are working twice as hard to make up for my absence." "They're managing fine," she assured him, settling a blanket over his legs. "And you're healing. That's your only job right now." He caught her hand as she straightened, pulling her gently down until she was sitting on the arm of his chair. "How did I get so lucky?" he wondered aloud, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "I believe you paid $1,000 for the privilege," she teased, her old hesitation finally giving way to acceptance of the unusual beginning of their relationship. Quincy's expression grew serious. "I would have paid 10 times that," he said quietly. "Not to own you, but for the chance to know you, to love you." Georgina leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to his lips there first. It was sweet and brief, but it carried the promise of a future neither had dared to imagine before. By April, Quincy was well enough to move around with the aid of a cane, though he still tired easily. Georgina had taken over much of the household management, allowing Martha to retire partially, a change the older woman welcomed with good-natured relief. "These old bones aren't what they used to be," she told Georgina, "and you've got a knack for running things smoothly." The truth was, Georgina had found purpose in her new role. The ranch that had initially been her prison had become her home, its people her family. And Quincy had become the center of her world. They were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, when Quincy turned to her with an uncharacteristically nervous expression. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," he said, shifting in his chair to face her more directly. "Something I've thought about every day since that night you told me you loved me." Georgina's heart quickened. "Yes." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I had Gabriel pick this up in Tucson last week," he explained, opening it to reveal a simple but beautiful ring, a small diamond flanked by 2 sapphires. "It reminded me of the stars we've watched together." Georgina stared at the ring, then at Quincy, her eyes wide. Georgina Clarke, he said solemnly, I know our beginning was unusual to say the least, but I want our future to be one we choose together as equals. He took her hand. Will you marry me? Tears filled her eyes, but they were tears of joy. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Quincy slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a gentle embrace, mindful of his still healing ribs. His kiss was tender but held the promise of passion to come, a future filled with love freely given and received. They were married in June in the small church in Ventura, the very town where they had met under such different circumstances. The townspeople, who had once stood by and watched Georgina be sold to pay her father's debts, now watched as she walked down the aisle toward the man who had saved her in more ways than one. Martha had helped her make her wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown of ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs. Quincy, standing at the altar with Gabriel beside him as best man, looked at her as if she were the most precious thing he had ever seen. Dearly beloved, the minister began, but Georgina hardly heard the words. All she could see was Quincy's face. All she could feel was the love radiating from him, wrapping around her like a protective embrace. When it came time for their vows, Quincy took both her hands in his. Georgina, he said, his voice steady and sure, I promise to love and cherish you all the days of my life, to respect you as my equal, to listen when you speak, to stand beside you in joy and sorrow. His blue eyes held hers. And I promise that the heart that once was broken will find only healing and happiness in my care. Tears slipped down Georgina's cheeks as she responded with her own vows. Quincy, I promise to love and honor you for as long as I live. To be your partner in all things, to share your burdens and your joys. She squeezed his hands. And I promise that the heart you have mended will be yours, faithfully and completely, for all our days together. Their life together unfolded with the changing seasons. The rocking prospered under their combined stewardship, Quincy's knowledge of cattle and land, Georgina's sharp mind for business, and Gabriel's talent for negotiation, making it one of the most successful operations in the territory. A year after their wedding, their first child was born, a son they named James, after Quincy's father. He had his mother's auburn hair and his father's blue eyes, and from his first days showed the strong will of both his parents. 2 years later, they welcomed twin daughters, Elizabeth and Catherine, who brought both joy and exhaustion to the household. Georgina sometimes found herself amazed at how full her life had become, how completely happiness had replaced the despair she had felt that day on the auction block. One evening, when the children were finally asleep and the ranch had settled into night's quiet rhythm, Georgina found Quincy on the porch, gazing up at the stars as he so often did. She slipped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his back. What are you thinking about? She asked softly. He turned in her embrace, drawing her close. About how close I came to missing all this, he admitted. If I hadn't ridden into Ventura that particular day at that particular hour. But you did, she reminded him, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. Some might call it fate. Quincy smiled, the smile that even after years of marriage still made her heart beat faster. Some might, he agreed. I call it the best $1,000 I ever spent, Georgina laughed, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. And to think I once resented you for it. And now? He asked, his arms tightening around her. Now, she said, her eyes shining with love, I thank God every day for the man who saw a woman with a broken heart and whispered, I'll mend it with mine. As the years passed, the story of their unusual meeting became a favorite family tale, told and retold with varying embellishments depending on which of their children was doing the telling. James, the practical one, focused on the business aspects, the outrageous sum his father had paid, the economic conditions that had led to such desperate measures. The twins preferred the romantic elements: the dashing cowboy, the damsel in distress, the dramatic rescue. Georgina and Quincy let them tell it as they would, exchanging private smiles at the parts only they would ever truly understand: the fear and uncertainty, the gradual building of trust, the moment when gratitude had finally given way to love untainted by obligation. By the time they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children, Gabriel and his wife, and the first of their grandchildren, the Rocking had grown into one of the largest and most respected ranches in Arizona. Quincy's innovative breeding practices and Georgina's shrewd investments had built a legacy that would sustain their family for generations to come. That night, after the celebration had ended and they were alone in the room they had shared for a quarter-century, Quincy took Georgina in his arms, his touch as gentle as it had been on their wedding night. 25 years, he marveled, his hair now streaked with silver but his blue eyes as bright as ever. "And you're more beautiful to me now than the day I met you." Georgina smiled, running her fingers through his hair. At 45, she had her own silver strands, and the years of Arizona sun had left fine lines around her eyes and mouth. But when Quincy looked at her like this, she felt as young and desirable as she had been at 20. "I think you need spectacles, Mr. Alexander," she teased. "My vision is perfect where you're concerned, Mrs. Alexander," he countered, bending to kiss her neck in the way he knew she loved. "Perfect enough to see that marrying you was the wisest decision of my life." As they lay together in the darkness, Georgina reflected on the journey that had brought them here from an auction block in a dusty town to a life richer and fuller than she could have imagined. The broken heart that had once seemed beyond repair now beat strongly, filled with love for the man beside her, the family they had created, the life they had built together. It was a story that had begun with a purchase, but had become priceless, a testament to the healing power of love freely given, and the truth that even the deepest wounds could mend in the hands of someone who cared enough to try.